Hello all of you beautiful people, Jules here for WhatCulture.com. And you know what, when it comes to horror films, the suspension of disbelief is at an all-time high. After all, we're dealing with supernatural killers for the most part, and so we'll often look at plot holes and logic gaps and just go, yeah, but at least the overall product is very entertaining. But sometimes, horror films set out explicit rules and then for some strange reason end up stupidly breaking them. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 horror movies you didn't realise stupidly broke their own rules. Number 10. Pain can end a nightmare, but only for Nancy. A Nightmare on Elm Street. So the rule is that early on in Wes Craven's original A Nightmare on Elm Street, it's established that protagonist Nancy is able to wake herself up from a nightmare by burning herself on the hot pipe within it. The implication being that a searing, painful physical sensation is enough to break Freddy's hold over somebody. But basically the entire rest of the franchise contradicts this, because the pain of Freddy attacking and striking his victims would surely be enough to wake them from their nightmares, right? Why does Tina suffer a horrifying, prolonged death at Freddy's hands without the possibility of escape, while Nancy is able to easily free herself? Elm Street has admittedly never professed to have a vice grip-like hold on its own internal logic, and this is clearly evident from the jump. If you wanted to fudge an explanation, I guess that you could perhaps suggest that the injury must be self-inflicted in order to escape, but you know what? That's a bit of a reach. Number 9. The acidity of xenomorph blood. Aliens. So Ridley Scott's original Alien makes it unforgettably clear that the face-hugger's highly acidic blood is capable of eating its way through 2 floors of the Nostromo in just a matter of seconds. But from James Cameron's superb sequel Aliens onwards, the acidity of the xenomorph blood is largely dialed back. We see Hicks able to free himself from his armor before the blood melts through it, and Vasquez's leg is somehow not melted down to the bone when it comes into contact with the blood, and of course Hudson's arm is in surprisingly decent condition after being burned by it. This inconsistently only grew in the subsequent sequels, such that it's basically a fool's errand to try and make crystalline sense of how strong xenomorph blood is truly meant to be. Number 8. The eye transplant lets Moon hear ghosts. The Eye. 2002's cult horror classic The Eye revolves around a blind classical violinist whose sight is then restored when she receives a pair of new eyes. Before long, however, she's able to see terrifying ghostly entities, and it's later revealed to be the result of her eye transplant, with the donor having possessed a psychic ability to foresee death. Now this is all well and good, except the main character is also able to hear the ghosts, which doesn't really make much sense if her new abilities are explicitly linked to the haunted eyes that she's just recently received. Clearly the filmmakers realized that it would be less scary if the ghosts were silent, and simply hoped that most audiences wouldn't notice this discrepancy, which in fairness, they actually didn't. Even so, the fact that her ears are able to also be affected by the supernatural hooey despite not being altered in any tangible way is actually totally baffling once you realize it. Number 7. The Xenos are weak against light, but attack in broad daylight. Alone in the Dark. Now Mr. Uwe Boll here admittedly isn't a filmmaker who seems to care much about internal consistency nor quality, but even so, his 2005 video game adaptation Alone in the Dark explains halfway through that the CGI beasties known as the Xenos are weak to sunlight. In fact, they literally state they live almost exclusively in the dark, sunlight is lethal in large doses. And though the film sticks to this rule until the very end, the final shot is a sequel-baiting jump scare in which the main protagonists are implied to be attacked by a Xeno. The scene takes place in broad daylight and so would certainly cause considerable harm to the creature, and yet the thing still manages to haul ass in their direction with extreme purpose. So what gives? Well, clearly the director just gave up pretty much in the same manner as most people did when watching this utter trash fire. Number 6. Seth forgets about microorganisms. The Fly. Now, it isn't fair to cut films slack just because they happen to be great. And so, as much as it pains me, David Cronenberg's 1986 masterpiece, The Fly, also falls afoul. It's clarified early on that Seth Brundle's telepods will successfully teleport a subject as long as they're the only living thing in the transmitting pod at the time. We even see Brundle successfully teleport a baboon to prove this. But as a scientist who spoke to Gizmodo about the film, stated there is one primary inconsistency here. The successful baboon experiment should have actually been a failure because of microorganisms that would have been absolutely found in this pod, especially given Brundle's clear flouting of the most basic and expected sterility standards present in any typical lab setting. Even a speck of dust within the transmission pod would contain bacteria and or fungus, resulting in some level of molecular fusion. And given how little care Brundle takes to keep his setup clean, the situation would have clearly been far more dire than that. Number 5. The new voice changer is basically magic. Scream 3. So the Scream franchise is wholly preoccupied with sending up the supposed rules to survive a horror movie, and though the series is built on a relatively shaky bed of realism as it is, it never really dared to flat out flirt with the supernatural, at least where the first two movies were concerned anyway. Scream 3 was widely criticized for basically falling prey to the groan-worthy horror sequel tropes that the first two movies so brilliantly mocked, though perhaps the most baffling thing about the entire movie is that goddamn voice changer. In the film's opening sequence, Ghostface reveals that he has a fancy new voice changer which allows him to select pre-programmed voices at a whim. Ghostface uses this throughout the film to mess with his victims by impersonating various characters, even though this technology absolutely did not exist in the late 90s, let alone today. Even if you suspend your disbelief that the killer Roman could use a secret piece of software to sample various voices of people known to him, credibility once again falters given that he also uses the voice changer to impersonate Sidney's long-dead mother Maureen. How the hell would he have got that sort of stuff? If the first two movies at least presented plausible enough explanations for Ghostface's teleportation by revealing there to be two serial killers, Scream 3 basically just stopped caring and said, you know what, it's just magic. Number 4. The Thing's imperfect mimicry. The Thing 2011. Both the original 1982 John Carpenter classic The Thing and this 2011 prequel make it crystal clear that the extraterrestrial creature is able to perfectly impersonate a human being, both in terms of their physical appearance and their knowledge. But the prequel introduces the wrinkle that the Thing cannot, however, replicate metal material, and at the end of the movie, protagonist Kate tells Carter that she knew he was human earlier on because his ear piercing was intact. But Carter then points to the wrong ear, confirming to Kate that he is indeed the Thing, prompting her to torch him and get the hell out of Dodge. And while the Thing would indeed be unable to replicate Carter's earring, it would still possess his knowledge of which ear he had pierced and be able to point to the correct one. So this time the alien was just stupid. Brilliant. Number 3. Sebastian's sudden teleportation abilities. Hollow Man. Teleportation may be a time-honored tradition of serial killers like Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees, but when scientist Dr. Sebastian takes an invisibility serum in Paul Verhoeven's horror classic Hollow Man, his only confirmed powers are invisibility and a blinding rage. But at the film's climax, we see Linda and Matt fleeing from an incapacitated Sebastian while their lab is rigged to blow. The explosion detonates while Linda and Matt are climbing their way to rather dubious safety, with the bomb seemingly obliterating Sebastian in the process. But somehow, a few moments later, Sebastian, now visible as a hideous vascular skeleton, appears out of nowhere, grabbing Linda's leg for one last scare, before she manages to send him hurtling down the fiery elevator shaft to his death. Except you have to ask, where the hell did Sebastian come from when he grabbed Linda? There's literally no explanation for him suddenly appearing, even though you could suggest that he was clinging to the elevator card traveling up and down the elevator shaft throughout the scene, but we should have been able to see him, right? He was inexplicably able to move from the lab area in the midst of an explosion, no less, to the elevator with no plausible explanation whatsoever beyond, well, it's just a movie. Of course, Hollow Man is a check your brain at the door B movie, but even so, this is a pretty ridiculous leap. Number 2. Gremlins aren't affected by snow. Gremlins. So everyone knows one of the main rules about Gremlins is don't get the Gremlins wet. But the breaker of this rule is of course the original Gremlins, which is set of course at Christmas. And in one memorable scene we see the creatures caroling through the neighborhood. But this begs the question, why doesn't the snow, which will melt and definitely become water, affect the Gremlins? There's obviously no chemical difference between snow and water, so there's no reason why snow that lands on them or simply permeates through the air wouldn't cause them to hatch more Gremlins from their backs when it melts. The series has enough issues with its own internal logic given the eternal debate about when exactly constitutes after midnight, but this is decidedly less ambiguous than that, because we can all agree that snow does indeed equal frozen water. Curiously though, the original script for the film did actually have a biology teacher explain that the Gremlins can't multiply at temperatures below 25 degrees, but that was cut, and thus creates this massive plot hole. And number 1, basically everything. Jaws: The Revenge. Right, so the last time that I had checked, sharks don't hold grudges, swim backwards, or roar like lions. But in Jaws: The Revenge, all of that happens. Now, even though we accept that each Jaws sequel was worse than the one before it, the first 3 at least tried to keep themselves faintly tethered to reality. But Jaws: The Revenge tried to convince audiences that, yes, sharks can indeed hold grudges, amongst other things. Bruce here is inexplicably back to terrorize the Brody family on a roaring rampage of revenge, revenge, seemingly possessing an innate, sustained knowledge of who the Brodys are and attempting to dispatch them with the efficiency of a suited and booted serial killer. It also knows where they are at all times and can swim backwards and also, weirdly, roar like a lion despite being, a shark. None of it makes any sense whatsoever, effectively taking the franchise's implicit no paranormal activity rule and devouring it whole.